911, what's your emergency?
There's blood in the water! He's not coming up! Oh my god! Please, you have to send someone!
The panicked voice on the line was Olivia Carter's, a tourist visiting Monterey Bay on what should have been a perfect summer morning. Moments earlier, she'd been photographing surfers against the backdrop of rolling waves. Then, in a heartbeat, the scene shifted: a shattered surfboard, a crimson trail spreading across the water, and the unmistakable rise of a massive dorsal fin. What followed would shake the coastal town to its core, an investigation into a scarred orca that seemed to be hunting far closer to shore than nature intended, raising urgent questions about what was driving this dangerous behavior and whether humans were to blame. Stick around, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the untold truths of our wild world. The morning of July 30th, 2025, started like many others along Monterey Bay, cool, damp, and carrying the faint scent of salt and kelp. A thin layer of mist clung to the water, softening the horizon, while the sound of waves echoed up and down the shore. The surf was bigger than usual that day. Long, clean sets rolled in from the open ocean, their peaks sharp under the early sunlight. For the local surfers, it was perfect. Mark Hensley, 29, stood barefoot on the wet sand, his surfboard tucked under his arm, a lifelong Monterey resident. Mark knew these waters better than most. He scanned the waves with practiced eyes, timing the sets, his hair still damp from the paddle out earlier that morning. Surfing wasn't just a hobby for him, it was part of his identity. Out in the lineup, he joined a handful of other surfers. When his wave came, he paddled hard, caught it clean, and dropped in with effortless balance. His friends on shore shouted in encouragement as he carved across the face, spraying water into the air. Then, everything changed. Just beyond the wave's crest, a dark, massive shape rose from below. A tall, scarred dorsal fin cut through the water's surface like a blade. Before anyone could react, the water exploded, and orca surged upward, its jaws opening wide. It hit Mark with incredible force, knocking him off his board. The board snapped in two, pieces scattering across the churning water. Shouts erupted from the beach. Some people screamed his name, others pointed in disbelief. The orca dove again, and for a moment, Mark's body disappeared beneath the surface. The water around him darkened with blood. On shore, Olivia Carter, a 32-year-old tourist from Colorado, had been photographing surfers since sunrise. Through her camera's lens, she had seen the dorsal fin appear, but her brain hadn't registered the danger until it was too late. The moment the attack happened, she dropped the camera against her chest and pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so hard she could barely dial. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice came through, steady and calm. There's blood in the water. He's not coming up. Oh my God, please, you have to send someone. Olivia's voice cracked. Her eyes locked on the chaos unfolding offshore. Lifeguards were already sprinting into the surf, rescue boards under their arms. A small rescue craft launched from the harbor, bouncing over the swells toward the scene. Within minutes, they reached Mark and pulled him aboard. Back on the beach, the crowd parted as rescuers carried him to dry sand. His wetsuit was torn in multiple places, deep gashes marking his arms and torso. A paramedic knelt beside him, starting CPR. The beach was silent, except for the rhythmic push of the medic's hands and the crashing waves. After several tense minutes, the lead paramedic looked up and gave a small shake of his head. A collective hush fell over the crowd. Olivia stood frozen, her phone still in her hand. Around her, people whispered to one another, voices low and shaken. Out beyond the breakers, the ocean kept moving as if nothing had happened. Its surface calm again, indifferent to the life it had just claimed. What had started as a perfect surf morning for Mark Hensley had turned into something no one on that beach would ever forget. In the hours after the incident, the beach was no longer a place for leisure. Yellow tape stretched between posts, marking off the area where surfers had been riding waves just that morning. Lifeguard towers stood empty, and the rhythmic calls of seabirds seemed muted against the low hum of official voices. The ocean itself looked unchanged, its surface still catching the light. but there was an unspoken heaviness in the air, like everyone on shore now saw it differently. Olivia Carter sat on a weathered bench near the parking lot, her camera bag resting by her feet. Her hands were still cold despite the midday sun. She spoke quietly to an officer taking her statement, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the shoreline. "It happened so fast," she said, her voice steady but distant, like a shadow rising from below. "I've never seen an orca move like that, never seen one act that way at all." She paused, searching for words, then shook her head slightly. It didn't seem real until the water turned red. Other surfers who had been in the water that morning lingered nearby, some still in damp wetsuits, their boards propped against railings. A few of them told officials they'd noticed orcas in the area over the past few weeks, sometimes close enough to spot the white patches behind their eyes. None of those encounters had been aggressive. They'd assumed it was rare luck to be in such proximity to such an animal. By early afternoon, news crews had arrived, setting up cameras and microphones. Reporters moved between officials and bystanders, their voices carrying just above the soft crash of waves. Monterey, usually a postcard-perfect coastal town, had quickly become the center of a story no one wanted to tell. The investigation was placed under the lead of Marine Inspector David Morales, a tall man with sun-browned skin who had spent much of his career studying marine accidents. Alongside him was forensic pathologist Linda Weaver, methodical and precise, who began her examination as soon as the body was transported from the beach. Preliminary findings painted a grim picture. The bite force alone had been enough to fracture ribs and tear deep muscle tissue. As word spread beyond Monterey, the incident stirred a mix of fear and curiosity. Social media lit up with speculation, grainy photos of orcas near the bay, and questions about what had caused such an attack. For every person calling it a tragic anomaly, another wondered aloud if the ocean itself was changing. Standing at the taped-off edge of the sand, Morales looked out at the water, his arms folded. The sun was dipping lower now, and the waves rolled in with a steady rhythm. He knew the community wanted answers. But what unsettled him most was the question he couldn't yet answer himself, whether this was an isolated tragedy or the first sign of something far more troubling beneath the surface. By the next morning, the investigation took a new turn. Dr. Howard Klein, a respected marine biologist with decades of field experience, arrived in Monterey. His work had taken him from icy Arctic waters to warm Pacific currents, and he was known for his calm, measured approach when the ocean presented difficult questions. Morales met him near the harbor, where fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. The two men stood by the water's edge, speaking in low tones as the scent of salt and diesel drifted through the air. Klein began with what he knew. Orcas, he explained, were among the most intelligent marine mammals capable of complex social behavior and known for avoiding unnecessary conflict with humans. Attacks were rare, almost unheard of in the wild. But, he cautioned, when primary food sources became scarce, patterns could shift. His research team had been monitoring Monterey Bay through satellite data and field surveys, and the numbers were troubling. Salmon populations had dropped sharply, and harbor seal sightings had declined to levels he hadn't seen in years. Both were critical food sources for orcas. The causes, Klein believed, were tied to human activity. Recent tracking showed several large-scale fishing vessels operating unusually close to the protected marine zone just outside the bay. While regulations existed, enforcement was inconsistent, and the impact on the ecosystem was becoming clear. When the ocean's balance is disrupted, he told Morales, the consequences ripple through every level of the food chain. Morales listened, absorbing the weight of those words. He had approached this case as a marine safety incident. But now it was beginning to look like something far larger, a collision between human exploitation and the needs of a powerful predator. The death of Mark Hensley might not have been random at all, but rather the inevitable outcome of an environment under stress. Just as Morales was considering his next steps, a call came through on his radio. A local fisherman had reported a close encounter earlier that morning, an orca with a distinctive long scar running down its dorsal fin, moving unusually close to shore. The location was only a few nautical miles from where Mark had been attacked. The fisherman claimed he'd never seen an orca behave quite like that, circling near the surface for several minutes before heading north along the coastline. Klein and Morales exchanged a glance. It wasn't proof, but it was more than coincidence. There was now a specific animal to look for, one that might be linked to the attack. Klein suggested a cautious approach, emphasizing observation over confrontation. Morales agreed, though a part of him knew the community would want answers quickly. The Scarred Orca had entered their story and, perhaps, would decide how it would end. 3 days later, Monterey woke under a low, heavy sky. The light was dim and flat, the horizon blurred where the gray water met the gray clouds. It felt as if the weather itself had bowed its head in quiet solidarity with the town's loss. Along the shoreline, folding chairs had been set up in neat rows facing the sea. People gathered slowly, speaking in hushed tones, the soft crunch of sand underfoot the only other sound. Mark Hensley's funeral was not a large one, but it was deeply personal. Family stood in the front row, close enough to hear the tide. Friends and fellow surfers filled the space behind them, many still in windbreakers and board shorts, their sun-bleached hair ruffled by the cool breeze. Some held their boards upright in the sand, a silent tribute to the man they had once paddled out alongside. Mark's mother sat clutching a framed photograph of her son, her hands trembling. Her eyes were swollen from days without rest. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked, but her words were steady. "My boy was born to love the ocean," she said, looking toward the waves. "But the ocean took him away from me." A few people wiped their eyes, and the sound of the surf filled the silence that followed. Among the mourners were several environmental advocates who had traveled to Monterey after hearing about the attack. They stood with signs tucked under their arms, reading messages about protecting marine habitats and respecting the balance of the sea. Some whispered about the role of overfishing and how the depletion of natural food sources might have driven predators closer to shore. There was no shouting or protest here, only the shared understanding that something in the relationship between humans and the ocean was shifting. Inspector David Morales stood off to the side with Dr. Howard Klein, watching the ceremony unfold. They spoke quietly, their words almost lost in the wind. Morales had just received confirmation from the latest report the Scarred Orca, spotted days earlier, was likely the same one involved in Mark's death. Klein nodded, his expression thoughtful but troubled. They both knew that identifying the animal didn't solve the larger mystery. Why had it been so close to the shoreline, and what had pushed it towards such dangerous behavior? As the service drew to a close, Mark's friends carried leis and wreaths of flowers to the water's edge, letting them drift out with the tide. People lingered even after the chairs were folded, staring out at the restless sea. The gray sky hung low, the waves kept moving, and the questions that had brought Morales and Klein together still waited for answers. The morning after the funeral. The harbor was quiet except for the low hum of engines warming in the cool air. Inspector David Morales stood on the deck of a patrol boat, his hands resting on the rail as Dr. Howard Klein came aboard with a small case of instruments. Neither spoke much as the crew prepared to leave. The weight of the previous days seemed to hang between them, and both understood why they were out there. They needed to find the Scarred Orca. The boat moved slowly along the Monterey coastline, staying within sight of the cliffs and kelp beds. Morales checked his notes against the reports from local fishermen, marking areas where sightings had been made. Klein monitored an array of underwater microphones, listening for patterns in the distant clicks and whistles of marine life. The ocean that morning was a muted steel color, the swell pushing against the hull with a steady rhythm. Each wave hit with a sound that seemed to echo the seriousness of their search. Hours passed without more than the occasional bird diving for fish or the shadow of a sea lion moving through the kelp. Then, as they crossed a stretch of water less than 3 kilometers from shore, Klein's expression sharpened. Through the headphones, he had picked up an unusual sequence, low pulses followed by a long, drawn-out call. He motioned for the boat to slow. Within minutes, the crew spotted movement ahead. The dorsal fin broke the surface, first tall, black, and marked by a pale, jagged scar that caught the light when the water slid away from it. The orca moved with deliberate ease, circling at a distance that felt intentional. From the deck, Morales watched the dark eyes track their position, unblinking and unreadable. For several long moments, it remained there, rising and dipping, never straying far from the boat. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, The orca slipped beneath the surface, leaving only a few ripples in its wake. The sea returned to its usual rhythm, but the absence of the animal felt heavier than its presence. Klein removed his headphones and rested them on the console. "It's not gone," he said quietly. "It's watching us." His tone carried no drama, only a measured certainty that made Morales look back at the empty water with a new unease. If an orca was willing to approach vessels this closely, and if hunger or altered instincts were driving its behavior, the people who made their lives on this coast could face risks they had never imagined. Morales knew they had to understand the reason, and quickly before the ocean delivered another tragedy. The small cafe by the harbor smelled faintly of coffee and sea air, its windows clouded from the morning chill. Morales and Klein sat at a corner table, their jackets still damp from the mist outside. Across from them was Samuel Grant, a weathered man with hands marked by years of hauling nets and repairing lines. His cap was pulled low over his brow, but his eyes were alert, sharp with the kind of knowledge that only comes from decades at sea. Samuel had been fishing in Monterey Bay for over 40 years. He spoke slowly, with the rhythm of someone who chose his words carefully. "I've seen that orca before," he began, his voice rough from salt air and early mornings. "Used to keep its distance. You'd see the fin out past the kelp beds, then it'd be gone. Never came this close to shore." He leaned back in his chair, recalling recent weeks. "Now it's different. I've spotted it more than once, right up against the shallows. It's been hunting seals, close to the beach, saw it take a sea lion not 50 yards from the sand. That's not usual behavior for one of them. Not here." He paused, his gaze drifting to the water beyond the window. This all started after one of those big industrial trawlers worked the line just outside the protected zone, pulled so much out of the water, the seals moved on. When the ocean's empty, a predator's got two choices: move somewhere else, or find new prey. Klein nodded slowly, his earlier theories lining up with Samuel's account. If the orca's food sources had been stripped away, desperation might have brought it into closer contact with humans. Hunger could override instincts that usually kept the species at a distance. Morales made notes, the implications growing heavier with each word Samuel spoke. The fisherman's voice lowered, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's hungry, Inspector. And when the sea doesn't feed it, it'll take whatever moves on the surface." Before Morales could respond, the static crackle of the marine radio from the counter caught his attention. The cafe owner, who also monitored local channels, turned up the volume. A voice from the Coast Guard station came through. Urgent, but controlled a group of tourists in kayaks, had just reported an orca approaching at high speed and striking one of their boats. The location was not far from the stretch of coastline where Mark had been attacked. Klein and Morales exchanged a quick look. Samuel simply stared out at the gray horizon, his weathered hands tightening around his coffee cup. Outside, the harbor seemed calm, but the message was clear: whatever was driving this animal's behavior wasn't easing, and the window to understand it was closing fast. By the time Morales and Klein reached the Coast Guard station, the call from the kayak group was still echoing through the airwaves. The rescue boat had already brought the survivors ashore, two of them visibly shaken, one cradling his arm in a makeshift sling. The overturned kayak had been towed in, its hull cracked from the impact. Sand clung to the survivors' wetsuits, and their voices trembled as they described what happened. They spoke of a dark shape rising beneath them, a massive dorsal fin slicing the surface. The scar, long, pale, unmistakable, had glinted under the weak sunlight before the animal rammed the kayak hard enough to send both paddlers into the water. One man said he'd felt the current pull as the orca swam past him, close enough to see its eye. The details matched perfectly with the earlier sightings, leaving no doubt that it was the same animal. Morales didn't hesitate. He ordered an immediate closure of the surrounding waters, extending several miles in each direction from the incident. The Coast Guard marked the boundaries and broadcast a red alert, halting all recreational activity: surfing, kayaking, swimming, until further notice. The usually lively bayfront was quiet within hours. Boards stacked against shop walls, rental stands shuttered, news spread quickly. Local channels interrupted regular programming with live coverage from the harbor, while social media filled with speculation and unease. Monterey, known for its inviting coastline, now carried an undercurrent of fear. Even from the streets above the shoreline, people glanced toward the water, as if expecting to see the fin appear at any moment. Klein spoke with reporters, his tone measured but firm. He explained that unless the root cause was addressed, restoring the natural food supply for the orca, the behavior was unlikely to stop. Hunger and habitat disruption, he said, were powerful forces, capable of pushing even the most intelligent marine predators into dangerous territory. Morales knew the truth in his words, but the solution was complicated. Restoring balance meant challenging large-scale fishing operations that had been draining the bay's resources for years, and those companies had deep influence. Tension grew as debates flared between conservationists, fishermen, and local officials. In the middle of these discussions, a new video surfaced online, shot from a pier under moonlight. It showed the Scarred Orca gliding silently just yards from the shore, its fin cut through the black water, illuminated by a single street lamp, before disappearing again into the dark. The clip was only 30 seconds long, but it was enough to unsettle the community further. The animal wasn't just lingering near the coast in daylight, it was coming in close under cover of night. To many, it no longer felt like a distant threat. It felt like something watching and waiting. On August 6, 2025, the decision finally came. Under growing public pressure and the persistent warnings from scientists, the state of California announced a temporary halt to all commercial fishing near the Monterey Marine Sanctuary. The order was immediate, and patrol vessels were sent out to enforce the closure. Alongside this, a specialized research team was deployed to monitor the Scarred Orca, tracking its movements without interference. Morales and Klein joined the observation effort, standing quietly on the deck of a research boat as it drifted at a respectful distance. The sea was calm that day, the kind of calm that feels rare after weeks of tension. Through binoculars, they watched the orca move in long, deliberate arcs, its dorsal fin cutting the surface like a slow metronome. Without boats chasing fish through its hunting grounds, the animal seemed less restless. Over the following hours, it moved farther out, each dive carrying it deeper into the open water until the last glimpse of its scarred fin disappeared beyond the swells. Back on shore, preparations were underway for Mark Hensley's memorial. Friends, family, and members of the local surfing community gathered on the sand in the late afternoon, the tide low and the light soft. A line of floral wreaths rested near the water's edge, each one woven with small pieces of driftwood and shells collected from the bay. When the moment came, they carried the wreaths into the shallows and set them adrift. The flowers spread gently across the surface, carried seaward by the same currents Mark had once chased on his board. People stood in silence, their reflections stretching in the wet sand. Mark's mother remained at the shoreline longer than most. She held no flowers, only her son's photograph, worn at the edges from being carried in her hands for days. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "We have to learn to respect the sea before it teaches us a costlier lesson." The words lingered in the air, folding into the sound of the waves. Around her, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The message was clear not just for Monterey, but for every place where human ambition meets the limits of the natural world. The Scarred Orca was gone, for now. Whether it would return was unknown. What remained certain was the truth that had driven every moment of the past week when the balance of the ocean is disturbed. The sea will find its own way to answer, and it will answer without hesitation. In the days after the Scarred Orca vanished into the open water, Monterey began to return to its rhythms. The beaches reopened, the fishing boats ventured out again, and the sound of laughter slowly replaced the hush that had settled over the bay. Yet, for those who lived through it, the memory of what happened would not fade so easily. Mark Hensley's death had been more than a tragic accident. It was a stark reminder of what happens when the balance between humans and the ocean is pushed too far. Overfishing, habitat disruption, and the constant pressure on marine ecosystems don't just affect the animals, they ripple back to us in ways we can't always predict. The Scarred Orca was not a monster, but a product of an environment under strain. If there's one lesson to take away, it's this: respect the sea and protect the life it holds, because once the balance is broken, nature will respond on its own terms. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more real and powerful stories from our wild world.